The winter wind cut through the empty fields of northern France like a blade. Snow had swallowed the old battlefield, softening the craters where shells once fell. Inside the wire fences of a sprawling American prisoner of war camp, hundreds of German soldiers huddled in coats too thin for the cold. Their boots were torn, their hands cracked from frost. The war had taken everything: uniforms, pride, and warmth. Yet that night on Christmas Eve of 1944, something extraordinary stirred among the guards and nurses of the U.S. Army Medical Corps. The camp, built hastily after the battles of Normandy, was meant to hold captured Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe men until transport. Rows of canvas tents lined the muddy ground. The sentries were young, some barely 20. Beyond the fences, the lights of a nearby field hospital flickered faintly through the snow. It was there, amid the smell of antiseptic and diesel heaters, that a small group of nurses decided to do something different, something human. Corporal Helen Carter had been on duty for 16 hours. She had seen German and American wounded arrive in the same truck, both bleeding, both silent. The nurses cleaned wounds without asking insignia or allegiance. "A man is a man when he's bleeding," one of them had whispered earlier that day. Perhaps that thought lingered when Carter suggested bringing hot chocolate to the prisoners for Christmas. It wasn't a grand gesture, just powdered cocoa, condensed milk, and water heated on field stoves. But in a place defined by coldness and wire, even a warm drink could mean rebellion against despair. As dusk deepened, snow began to fall again, thick, heavy flakes that muffled sound and blurred the guards' outlines. Inside the enclosure, German voices hummed faintly with a Christmas tune. Someone had carved a small cross out of scrap wood. Another drew a Christmas tree in the snow using a stick. Despite the humiliation of captivity, they clung to fragments of home. Then the gate opened. 2 American guards stepped aside, followed by 3 nurses in heavy coats carrying metal canisters. Steam rose from the lids. The prisoners froze, unsure if this was inspection or punishment. But when the sweet scent of chocolate reached them, confusion spread. One nurse smiled softly and gestured to the nearest man. Tentatively, he took a cup, murmured a quiet "dank." Others followed, hesitant at first, then crowding gently around, hands trembling more from disbelief than from cold. No orders, no propaganda, just silence and gratitude. One guard said later it was the first time he had seen the prisoners' faces without suspicion in their eyes. The hot chocolate wasn't victory, wasn't surrender. It was recognition that even enemies could still share warmth. Beyond the fence, artillery thunder still echoed far away. But within that small pocket of mercy, for a brief moment the war paused. By the closing months of 1944, the war in Europe had changed shape. German divisions that once marched with precision across France now trudged through snow in defeat. The Normandy breakout, the fall of Paris, and the encirclement of the Ruhr had turned the tide completely. For every Allied casualty, there were now dozens of German prisoners, captured in frozen fields or surrendering in small groups near towns the Wehrmacht could no longer defend. By December, the United States Army was holding nearly 400,000 German POWs across camps in France, Belgium, and the American homeland. The prisoners arrived by train, truck, and sometimes even on foot. Many were dazed, exhausted, and underfed. In most camps, the barbed wire enclosed not hatred but resignation. The men inside had fought fiercely, but they knew it was over. The U.S. Army, following the Geneva Convention of 1929, ensured humane treatment for all captured soldiers. Each prisoner received food nearly equal to that of an American GI: white bread, coffee, soup, occasionally meat. It was not generosity, it was discipline and insistence that the United States would not mirror the cruelty it fought against. Red Cross inspectors visited camps regularly, and Army chaplains, sometimes German-speaking, held services for both sides. Yet the winter of 1944-45 was not only about policy, it was about morale. Many guards and medics were themselves young, far from home during Christmas. They knew that while Europe froze, families in America were hanging lights, baking pies, and praying for letters from the front. The feeling of separation was heavy, and in that loneliness, compassion became a kind of resistance, a quiet rebellion against the war's relentless inhumanity. In one such camp, near the town of Epinal in eastern France, the 44th Evacuation Hospital treated both Allied wounded and captured Germans. The nurses worked in unheated tents under canvas roofs dripping from condensation. The wounded arrived on stretchers blackened with soot, faces pale from shock. The medical teams didn't ask who had fired the bullets. They just stitched, dressed, and moved on. When the nurses heard that Christmas Eve was approaching, they wanted to mark it somehow. There would be no carols, no chaplain's sermon. They were too busy, but they could at least share warmth. "We'll make cocoa for the boys," someone said, referring to the American patients. Then another voice quietly added, "And for the prisoners too." That second line carried a kind of weight. Nobody objected. What they did next would ripple beyond the camp fence. It wasn't planned as an act of diplomacy, only decency. Yet in the darkest winter of the war, a simple choice to treat the enemy as human would leave a memory stronger than any order ever written. That night when the field stoves began to hum and the chocolate scent drifted into the cold, even the guards paused. They knew something unusual was about to happen. For the nurses of the 44th Evacuation Hospital, duty had become routine survival. They woke before dawn, hands numb from the cold, faces hidden beneath scarves stiff with frost. Their world was a rhythm of stretchers, morphine, and silence broken by the hum of generators. Some were barely in their 20s. Others had served since North Africa, yet through exhaustion and fear they carried an unspoken conviction that mercy was not weakness but strength. Each nurse had her own story. Lieutenant Ruth Daniels had been a teacher before the war. She'd once told her students that compassion was courage in slow motion. Now, in a makeshift ward of wounded men, Americans and Germans side by side, those words came alive. She had tended to soldiers whose uniforms still smelled of gunpowder, whose eyes were too empty to hate. Her hands shook the first time she stitched the wound of a German paratrooper, but when he whispered dank with cracked lips, the war suddenly felt smaller. In another tent, Nurse Margaret Lewis kept a pocket Bible tucked in her coat. She read it between shifts, not for prayer, but for perspective. "Love thy enemy," she once murmured, half to herself. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about staying human when everything around you demanded otherwise. As Christmas approached, these women and the few male medics among them found themselves longing for a gesture that reminded them who they were before the war began. Rations were thin, spirits thinner. The only luxury they had was a box of cocoa powder sent from home. A few tins of condensed milk, some sugar, and clean water were all it took. They gathered in the hospital mess tent that afternoon, lighting the stoves and stirring the mixture until the scent filled the air. Someone joked that it smelled like childhood. Someone else began humming a carol. When word reached the command tent, no one stopped them. The camp commander, a weary major who had lost too many friends that year, simply nodded. "If it keeps morale up," he said, "do it." He knew what it meant, not for the prisoners, but for his own people. Compassion was sometimes the last thread tying soldiers to sanity. That evening, as the nurses prepared to carry the steaming canisters to the wire, they did so without ceremony. No orders, no speeches, just quiet purpose. Snow fell again, muffling their boots as they crossed the compound. Behind the fence, the prisoners had gathered near the floodlights, drawn by the smell that reminded them of something they hadn't felt in years: warmth. The nurses walked side by side, not as soldiers, not as conquerors, but as caretakers of something fragile, something the war hadn't yet destroyed. The guards unlatched the gate. The cold air rushed in, carrying silence with it. What happened next would turn a moment of kindness into a story whispered long after the gunfire ceased. The snow had stopped, leaving the night eerily still. A pale moon hung above the camp, its light glinting off barbed wire and frost-coated helmets. Inside the enclosure, the prisoners were huddled near oil drum fires, murmuring softly in German. Some clutched small carvings, others stared into the flames as if trying to imagine a home that still existed somewhere beyond the war. The air smelled of smoke and pine sap. Then from across the yard came the rhythmic crunch of boots in snow. The sentries turned first, rifles slung low but ready. 3 American nurses approached with canisters steaming in their arms, accompanied by a medic pushing a cart stacked with tin cups. No one spoke. Even the guards seemed unsure whether to salute or stand aside. For a heartbeat, the camp held its breath. When the nurses reached the gate, one of the guards looked at his superior. The officer hesitated, then nodded once. The gate creaked open. A rush of frigid air swept through as the women stepped inside. The prisoners straightened instinctively, uncertain whether to stand at attention or retreat. Lieutenant Daniels lifted a cup, poured, and handed it to the nearest prisoner, a young man no older than her brother back home. His fingers trembled as he took it. Steam rose between them, blurring the distance of language and allegiance. "Merry Christmas," she said quietly. The man nodded, eyes wet, unable to reply. Around them, the scene unfolded like something out of time. The nurses poured, the guards passed cups down the line, and the prisoners, soldiers who had once fought in places like Normandy, Aachen, and the Ardennes, accepted each one as if it were a miracle. Some sipped cautiously, others closed their eyes, letting the warmth spread through their chest. One began to hum a carol, still knacked. The melody caught like wind in dry grass, spreading softly across the camp until even the Americans recognized it. Without planning it, one of the nurses joined in. Her voice was fragile but clear. Others followed, English mixing with German beneath the winter sky. Silent night, holy night, 2 languages, 1 song. The guards lowered their rifles. No one ordered them to. The war, for a fleeting moment, had no sides. Later, the prisoners would remember how strange the silence felt after the song ended. No gunfire, no shouts, just the faint hiss of cooling metal cups, some whispered prayers. Others stared at the nurses as if memorizing their faces, unsure why enemies had shown them mercy. For the Americans, it wasn't about forgiveness. It was about remembering what they were fighting for, a world where humanity could still exist, even behind barbed wire. When the last cup was empty, the nurses packed up quietly. As they walked back toward the tents, one of the guards murmured, "Ma'am, they'll never forget that." She didn't answer. She just looked back once at the prisoners standing in silence, cups in hand, and kept walking through the snow. The following morning, the camp seemed strangely lighter. The same barbed wire, the same guards, the same rations, but something invisible had shifted. The prisoners lined up quietly for breakfast, nodding at the sentries in small gestures of respect that hadn't existed before. Even the guards, hardened by months of duty, noticed. "It's quieter today," one wrote in his journal. "Almost peaceful." Word of what had happened spread quickly through the American ranks. Some officers smiled, others frowned. Officially, the nurses hadn't broken any rule. There was no order against kindness, but in wartime, compassion could feel like defiance. Yet the camp commander didn't reprimand anyone. He simply said, "If this war is ever going to end right, it'll take more than bullets." Among the prisoners, the story became legend almost overnight. One man, a former Wehrmacht corporal named Karl Brenner, wrote about it years later in a memoir published in 1958. He described that night not as charity, but revelation. "When they gave us that chocolate, I realized the Americans weren't monsters. They were just men and women who wanted to go home, too." Brenner's account wasn't unique. Dozens of former POWs would later speak of the same moment, each recalling the same feeling of disbelief, how their captors had shown them more mercy than their own officers ever had. In some cases, those memories transformed lives. After the war, a few former prisoners emigrated to the United States, citing their treatment in captivity as the reason. One even wrote to the War Department in 1947, asking if he could thank the nurse with the kind eyes who gave me cocoa on Christmas Eve. His letter was filed and lost among thousands, but the sentiment lived on. For the nurses, the event was hardly mentioned in reports. It wasn't recorded in any after-action summary or official correspondence. To them, it had been a moment of conscience, not history. But decades later, historians piecing together the daily lives of POWs during the Second World War would find these fragments, the letters, the recollections, the Red Cross diaries, and realize the moral power hidden in such small acts. In a war that produced industrial-scale cruelty, from death camps to bombed cities, the image of American nurses handing cups of hot chocolate to their prisoners stands out like a flicker of light in the dark. It reminded both sides that decency could survive even under the weight of total war. Years later, when one of the nurses was interviewed for an oral history project, she was asked why she did it. Her answer was simple: because someone's son was standing in that snow, and I thought maybe a mother back in Germany was praying for him just like mine prayed for me. In that truth lay the heart of the moment. War divides armies, but not humanity. History remembers battles by names, not by gestures. It lists the places where men died, Normandy, Bastogne, Aachen, but seldom where compassion survived. Yet in the quiet act of those nurses on Christmas Eve, something profound took shape, a victory that required no weapons, no orders, and no surrender. It was the victory of humanity over habit, the refusal to let war define what it meant to be human. When peace finally came in 1945, the world was too exhausted to celebrate moments like these. The headlines spoke of surrenders, tribunals, and treaties. But in small corners of memory, soldiers and prisoners alike carried images that didn't fit into military reports. A steaming cup passed through wire, a shared song beneath the stars, a night when enemies looked at each other and didn't see monsters. Historians now understand that the humane treatment of German POWs under American care played a crucial role in shaping post-war reconciliation. Many former prisoners returned to Germany with unexpected respect for their captors. Some became community leaders, mayors, or teachers in the new Federal Republic, spreading a different understanding of the enemy they had once been taught to hate. That empathy, planted in those camps, helped mend what politics alone could not. The nurses who served in Europe rarely spoke of their service afterward. Most went home, married, raised families, and quietly carried the memories of the war in silence. But for those who were there that Christmas Eve, the memory lingered as proof that compassion could survive amid destruction. One nurse wrote in a letter to her sister, "We gave them cocoa, but really we were reminding ourselves that we hadn't turned cold inside." The story resurfaced decades later in a local newspaper in Illinois. A journalist had interviewed a former POW living in America who still remembered the night the nurses came. "It was the first time I felt forgiven," he said softly, "even though I hadn't asked." That single line captured what the battlefield could never achieve: redemption without victory, peace without surrender. Today, historians looking back on the Second World War often emphasize technology, tactics, and strategy. But between the tanks and timelines lies another kind of legacy: the small acts that restored meaning in a world gone mad. A cup of hot chocolate might seem trivial beside the thunder of artillery, but in its simplicity lay the essence of why humanity endured. As snow fell across Europe that night, countless men dreamed of home. Yet for a few, their most enduring memory of the war would not be fire or fear, but warmth, passed from the hands of an American nurse to a German prisoner, beneath a sky briefly free of war. Sometimes the most powerful victory on Christmas Eve wasn't won with a rifle, but with kindness served in a metal cup.